The afternoon sun cast long, melancholic shadows across Riverside Park as Robert Mitchell settled onto his usual bench with the deliberate precision of a man whose life had been reduced to ritual. The same weathered wooden seat, third plank from the left, slightly warped from decades of rain and sun, bore the invisible imprint of his body after 15 years of daily occupation. His calloused hands, marked with liver spots and old scars from shrapnel that had never fully healed, trembled as they closed around the Purple Heart medal like a prayer clutched against the darkness. The ribbon had faded to a dull burgundy over the years, its edges frayed from countless anxious touches, and the bronze surface had been worn smooth by 45 years of guilty caresses. Each thread of that ribbon told a story of sleepless nights, of fingers that couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop seeking some tactile connection to a past that refused to stay buried. The metal itself had taken on the warmth of human touch, as if it had absorbed not just the heat of Robert's hands but the very essence of his grief. 3 o'clock. Always 3 o'clock. The same time David Thompson had died in a jungle clearing half a world away, calling out for help that never came, his voice echoing across decades to haunt the dreams of the man who had failed to answer. Robert's internal clock had been frozen at that moment for nearly half a century, an eternal countdown to a moment of choice that had defined every day since, every breath since, every heartbeat that felt like a betrayal of the friend who would never breathe again. The metal felt heavier today, as if David's ghost was pressing down on his shoulders with invisible hands that grew more substantial with each passing year, whispering the same question that haunted his dreams and waking hours alike. "Why didn't you come back for me, Bobby? Why did you leave me there to die alone in the mud and the rain, calling your name until my voice gave out?" Robert's weathered face, a roadmap of guilt etched in deep lines and premature aging, stared at the medal as if it might finally surrender the absolution he'd been seeking for nearly half his lifetime. His thumb traced the embossed profile of George Washington, with the devotion of a penitent touching a rosary, remembering with crystal clarity the day this medal should have been pinned to David's chest in a ceremony of honor, instead of being handed to him in a blood-stained envelope by a chaplain who couldn't meet his eyes and whose hands shook almost as badly as Robert's did now. The park around him buzzed with the gentle activity of a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Children played on swings in the distance, their laughter a stark contrast to the silence that lived in Robert's chest, like a tumor of regret. Young mothers pushed strollers along the winding paths, their conversations a symphony of ordinary concerns. Naptime schedules, grocery lists, weekend plans, the beautiful mundanity of lives untouched by the kind of loss that stops time in its tracks. Joggers maintained their steady rhythms, earbuds blocking out the world as they pursued their personal goals, and elderly couples fed breadcrumbs to persistent pigeons with the patient devotion of people who had learned to find joy in small rituals. Life continued its relentless march forward, but Robert remained frozen in 1978, in a moment when everything changed forever, when a young sergeant had to choose between saving his best friend and saving hundreds of strangers, and had chosen duty over love, mission over loyalty, the greater good over the man who had shared his last piece of chocolate and his deepest fears. He remembered David's face with photographic precision, every detail burned into his memory, with the clarity that only trauma can provide. The crooked smile that could light up even the darkest bunker, earned from a childhood accident that had left him with a chipped front tooth he'd never bothered to fix. The way he'd talk about his girl back home, Rose, and how her belly was growing round with their first child, his hands moving in the air to describe the curve of her pregnancy as if he could conjure her presence through gesture alone. David would pull out that creased photograph every night, showing it to anyone who'd listen, his voice filled with wonder and terror at the thought of becoming a father at 22. The photograph had been taken at a church picnic, Rose in a yellow sundress that brought out the gold in her brown hair, her hand resting on her still flat stomach in a gesture of protection and promise. David had told him the story 100 times, how he'd proposed to her right there at that picnic, dropping to one knee in front of half the congregation, how she'd said yes before he'd even finished asking the question, how they'd planned their whole life together in whispered conversations on her front porch swing. "She's going to be beautiful, Bobby," David would say, his Chicago accent thick with emotion and homesickness. "Just like her mama." Gonna have Rose's eyes and my stubborn streak. Poor kid doesn't stand a chance. Then he'd laugh, that infectious sound that could make even the most hardened soldiers smile despite themselves, despite the fear that lived in all their hearts like a constant companion. David had been the heart of their unit, the one who remembered everyone's birthday, who shared his care packages from home, who could make them laugh even when they were knee-deep in mud and misery. He'd been the one who'd organized the poker games that kept their minds off the war, who'd written letters for the guys who couldn't read or write, who'd held Jimmy Martinez while he died from a sniper's bullet, whispering promises that Jimmy's mother would know how much he loved her. The sound of approaching footsteps barely registered in Robert's consciousness until a gentle voice broke through the fog of memory, like sunlight through storm clouds, warm and unexpected, and somehow familiar in a way that made his heart skip a beat. "Excuse me, sir?" Robert looked up slowly, his eyes taking a moment to focus on the present, to leave behind the jungle and the ghosts and return to this peaceful park where children played and mothers walked, and life continued its eternal dance. Before him stood a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with kind brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond her years, eyes that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a simple blue dress that complemented her warm complexion and spoke of someone who valued comfort over fashion, substance over style. In her arms, she cradled a baby, maybe 6 months old, whose tiny fist was wrapped around her finger with the determined grip of someone who had no intention of letting go. The child was beautiful in the way that all babies are beautiful, but there was something more, something that tugged at Robert's memory like a half-remembered song. The baby's eyes were a startling blue, bright and alert and somehow familiar, and his hair was the color of wheat in summer sunlight. There was something achingly familiar about the woman's face, though Robert was certain they'd never met. Something in the set of her jaw, the way she tilted her head slightly when she spoke, the gentle curve of her smile that spoke of someone who had known love and loss in equal measure. It tugged at memories he couldn't quite place, like trying to remember a dream upon waking, fragments of recognition that danced just beyond his grasp. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of someone who had grown up in the Midwest, but had traveled far enough to soften the harder edges of regional accent. She shifted the baby to her other arm with practiced ease, the movement so natural it spoke of months of experience, of nights spent walking the floors and days spent learning the intricate language of infant needs. "I walk by here every day on my way to the library with little David, and I always see you sitting here with that medal. I hope you don't mind me asking, but that medal, did you lose someone special?" Robert's throat constricted, as if invisible hands were squeezing the air from his lungs, cutting off not just his breath, but his ability to form words, to give voice to the pain that had lived inside him for so long it had become part of his very DNA. In 45 years of carrying this burden, no one had ever asked, not directly, not with such genuine concern radiating from their voice like warmth from a hearth on a cold winter night. Strangers had glanced at him with curiosity or pity over the years, their eyes sliding away when they caught sight of the medal, uncomfortable with the weight of whatever story it might represent. Family members had tried to coax the story from him with varying degrees of success and frustration, his sister Margaret spending years trying to break through the wall he'd built around his heart. Therapists had probed with clinical detachment, their questions feeling like surgical instruments, designed to cut away the infected tissue of his guilt. But no one had simply asked with such honest compassion, such genuine human connection. He studied her face more carefully, noting the way she held her baby protectively against her chest, the same instinctive gesture he'd seen David make when cradling his rifle during those long, terrifying nights in the jungle when sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford and death could come from any shadow. There was strength in her posture, but also a vulnerability that spoke of someone who understood loss, even if she'd never experienced it firsthand, someone who had been raised on stories of sacrifice and had learned to recognize the weight of grief in others. It's complicated," Robert managed, his voice rough from disuse and emotion, the words feeling foreign on his tongue as if he'd forgotten how to speak about anything that mattered, anything that went deeper than the weather or the score of last night's game. "This medal, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to someone who should have made it home. Someone who deserved to see his family again, to hold his daughter, to teach her how to ride a bike and scare away the boys who came calling. Sarah's expression softened like butter in warm sunlight, her eyes filling with a compassion that seemed to reach across the space between them and touch something in Robert's chest that had been frozen for decades. She glanced around the park, taking in the peaceful scene of everyday life continuing its eternal dance, the joggers and the dog walkers, the teenagers playing frisbee, and the old men playing chess, then gestured to the empty space beside him on the bench. "Would you mind if I sat down?" she asked, her voice gentle but not patronizing, respectful but not distant. "David here gets fussy when I keep walking for too long, but he seems to calm down when we stop and rest for a while. There's something about this particular spot that he likes." "David?" The name hit Robert like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and making his vision blur at the edges, as if someone had just struck him across the face with an open hand. His heart began to race with a rhythm he hadn't felt since those terrifying moments under fire, when adrenaline and fear had combined to make every second feel like an eternity. "Your son's name is David. David Thompson, Jr., Sarah said with a proud smile that transformed her entire face, lighting it up from within as she settled beside him with the careful grace of someone accustomed to moving with a baby in her arms. "Named after my grandfather. He died in Vietnam before my mother was born. My grandmother always said he had an angel watching over him, someone who tried to save him but couldn't. She never knew who it was, but she always believed that somewhere out there was someone who cared enough to try, someone who carried the weight of that failure, even though it wasn't really a failure at all." The Purple Heart slipped from Robert's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto the concrete walkway with a sound that echoed like gunfire in his ears, like the metallic ring of bullets striking metal that had been the last thing David Thompson had heard before the world went silent forever. The sound transported him instantly back to that jungle clearing, where the acrid smell of gunpowder had mixed with the sweet scent of tropical flowers in a combination that had haunted his dreams for decades. Suddenly, Robert was 23 again, crouched behind a fallen log with enemy fire whistling overhead like deadly hornets, his radio crackling with urgent messages from base command. He could smell the oppressive humidity of the Vietnamese jungle pressing against his skin like a wet blanket, could feel the weight of the intelligence packet in his breast pocket, could hear David's voice calling his name through the chaos and confusion of battle, growing weaker with each repetition until it was barely a whisper carried on the wind. "Thompson," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle sounds of the park around them, above the laughter of children and the rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze. David Thompson from Chicago, 22 years old. Talked about his girl back home every single night, said she was pregnant with his first child, said he was going to teach that baby how to throw a curveball and bake his grandmother's apple pie recipe. Said he was going to buy a little house with a white picket fence and a tire swing in the backyard. Sarah's face went pale as winter snow, her free hand flying to her mouth in shock and recognition, her eyes widening as the impossible became possible, as the past reached across decades to touch the present in ways that defied explanation. The baby in her arms gurgled softly, as if sensing the sudden shift in the emotional atmosphere, his tiny fingers reaching toward the medal that lay glinting on the ground between them, like a bridge between two worlds. How do you know that?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and disbelief, with the kind of desperate need for answers that comes from a lifetime of questions. "How could you possibly know those details? Those exact details that my grandmother used to tell my mother, that my mother told me." Robert bent slowly to retrieve the medal, his joints protesting the movement with the sharp reminders of age and old injuries that had never quite healed properly, wounds both physical and emotional that time had scarred over, but never truly erased. When he straightened, tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the accumulated dust of memory and regret, through the careful mask he'd worn for so many years that he'd almost forgotten what his real face looked like underneath. His hands shook violently as he held the Purple Heart, but for the first time in decades, the trembling wasn't from guilt alone. There was something else now, something that felt almost like hope, like the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the story didn't have to end with failure and regret. "Because I was there," he said, his voice breaking like a dam under too much pressure, like a man who had been holding back an ocean of grief for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let it flow. I was his sergeant. I was supposed to bring him home. I was supposed to keep him safe, and I failed. I failed him, and I failed his family. And I've been carrying that failure every day since, every breath since, every heartbeat that felt like a betrayal. The baby reached out with tiny, perfect fingers, grasping at the ribbon of the medal with the innocent curiosity of someone who had never known loss or regret, who lived in a world where everything was new and wonderful and full of possibility. Sarah stared at Robert with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul, recognition dawning like sunrise after the longest night, like the first light of hope after decades of darkness. "You're him," she breathed, her voice filled with wonder and disbelief, with the kind of awe that comes from witnessing a miracle. "You're the angel my grandmother talked about. Robert Mitchell. She kept your letters for 60 years, kept them in a shoebox under her bed, tied with a blue ribbon that had belonged to my grandfather." "My letters?" Robert's voice cracked like old leather, like something that had been stretched beyond its breaking point and was finally giving way. "What letters?" "I wrote so many letters after the war, trying to find families, trying to return personal effects, trying to make sense of what had happened." "After the war you wrote to my great-grandmother," Sarah explained, her voice growing stronger as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "3 letters, trying to find David's family, trying to return his personal effects and tell us how he died. You wanted to give us his dog tags, his wallet, the photograph of my great-grandmother that he carried everywhere, but we'd moved by then. Grandma Rose had to leave Chicago after David was killed. She was young, pregnant, scared, and alone. The city held too many memories, too many places where she expected to see him walking around the corner. Robert felt the world tilt on its axis, as if everything he'd believed about his life was suddenly being rewritten by an invisible hand, as if the story he'd been telling himself for 45 years was only half the truth. "She kept them. After all these years, even though she never knew who I was? She used to read them to my mother when she was little," Sarah continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, her voice thick with emotion, but steady with conviction. "She'd tell her about the soldier who had tried to save her daddy, who had cared enough to write to a family he'd never met. Mum grew up knowing that somewhere out there was a man who had loved her father like a brother, who had carried the weight of his death like a cross." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn envelope, yellowed with age and handled with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "I carry this with me everywhere," she said, holding it out to Robert with trembling hands. "It's one of your letters. Grandma Rose gave it to my mother before she died, and Mum gave it to me when David was born. She said I should carry it so that part of my grandfather would always be with us." Robert took the envelope with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold it, his eyes focusing on the familiar handwriting that he hadn't seen in decades. His own words, written in the careful script of a young man trying to make sense of an impossible situation, trying to find meaning in meaningless loss. "Dear Mrs. Thompson," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper, "I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I had to try. My name is Robert Mitchell, and I served with your husband David in Vietnam. I want you to know that he died thinking of you and your baby. He talked about you every day, showed your picture to everyone who would look. He was the best man I ever knew, and I failed him. I should have brought him home to you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge across time, connecting the young soldier who had written them in a moment of desperate grief to the old man, who read them now with the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. Sarah was crying openly now, but her tears seemed to be washing away years of questions, years of wondering about the man who had cared enough to write. "You didn't fail him," she said firmly, her voice cutting through his self-recrimination like a sword through silk. "You loved him. You carried him with you all these years. That's not failure. That's devotion." Robert stared at the baby in Sarah's arms, and suddenly he could see it clearly, the resemblance that had been nagging at him since she'd first approached. The child had David's eyes, that same intense blue that could see straight through to the truth of things, that had made him such a good judge of character and such a loyal friend. The same stubborn chin that had gotten David into trouble more times than Robert could count. The The same way of looking at the world with curious intensity, as if everything was a puzzle waiting to be solved. But there was more than just physical resemblance. There was something in the baby's expression, a kind of old soul wisdom that reminded Robert of the way David had looked at that photograph of Rose, with a love so pure and deep it seemed to transcend the physical world. This child was David's legacy, his continuation, the future he had died protecting. "I promised him," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle sounds of the park, above the distant laughter of children and the soft rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze. "The night before the ambush, he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd take care of his family. I'd make sure they knew he died thinking of them, that he died with their names on his lips and their love in his heart." "Tell me," Sarah said quietly, shifting the baby so she could reach out and place her free hand on Robert's arm, her touch warm and somehow healing. "Tell me what happened. Please, I need to know. We all need to know." Robert closed his eyes, and the words came pouring out like water through a broken dam, carrying with them 45 years of accumulated guilt and grief, 45 years of sleepless nights and haunted days. He told her about the reconnaissance mission that had taken them deep into enemy territory, about the intelligence they'd gathered that could save hundreds of American lives, about the weight of responsibility that had pressed down on his young shoulders like a mountain. He told her about David's excitement at receiving a letter from Rose just days before the ambush, about how he'd read it aloud to the entire unit, sharing the news that his daughter had been born healthy and beautiful, 8 pounds and 2 ounces of perfect possibility. David had cried when he read that letter, tears of joy and heartbreak combined, knowing that he was a father, but not knowing if he'd ever get to hold his child. "He carried that letter everywhere after that," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion and memory. "Kept it in his breast pocket right over his heart. Said it was his good luck charm, that as long as he had Rose and the baby close to his heart, nothing could touch him. He was going to name her Margaret after his mother, but Rose had written that she wanted to wait for him to come home so they could choose together." He told her about the ambush, about the sudden eruption of gunfire that had scattered their unit like leaves in a hurricane, about the chaos and confusion that had turned their carefully planned mission into a nightmare of smoke and blood and screaming, about David getting separated from the group during the initial attack, about the impossible choice between saving his best friend and completing the mission that would prevent a major enemy offensive. "The intelligence we'd gathered," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger as he finally gave voice to the story he'd carried alone for so long. "It was about a planned attack on a base camp where over 300 American soldiers were stationed. If we didn't get that information back, they would all die, but David was trapped, wounded, calling for help." He described the moment of choice with painful clarity, the way time had seemed to slow down as he crouched behind that fallen log, hearing David's voice growing weaker, seeing the enemy soldiers closing in on his position, the weight of the intelligence packet in his pocket, the faces of the 300 soldiers who would die if he didn't complete the mission, the sound of his best friend calling his name through the smoke and chaos. "I can still hear him calling my name," Robert said, his voice breaking completely now, the words coming out in ragged gasps, as if each one was being torn from his chest. "I can still see his face through the smoke and the chaos. He was wounded, trapped behind enemy lines, and he was calling for me to come back for him. But I had the intelligence, I had information that could save hundreds of our boys, and I had to get it back to base." Sarah was crying now, but her voice remained steady and strong, anchored by a lifetime of stories about sacrifice and duty, about the impossible choices that define us, and the love that sustains us through the darkest moments. "So you chose to save the many instead of the one." "I chose the mission over my friend," Robert said bitterly, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "I left him there to die alone, and I've lived with that choice every day since. I completed the mission. The intelligence saved those 300 soldiers, but David died calling my name, and I wasn't there to answer." He told her about the aftermath, about returning to base with the intelligence and learning that David's position had been overrun, about the search and rescue mission that had found his body 3 days later, about the Purple Heart ceremony, where he'd been given David's medal along with his personal effects, about the weight of that bronze star that had felt heavier than any burden he'd ever carried. "I tried to find your family after the war," Robert continued, his voice growing quieter as he approached the part of the story that had haunted him most. "I wrote letter after letter, trying to track down Rose, trying to return David's things and tell her how he died. But you'd moved, and the trail went cold. I spent years wondering what had happened to you all, whether Rose had remarried, whether David's daughter had grown up knowing about her father." "She did," Sarah said softly. "Grandma Rose made sure of that. She told my mother everything, how they met, how he proposed, how excited he was about becoming a father. She kept his memory alive through stories and photographs and the letters you wrote. My mother grew up knowing she was loved by a father she'd never met." Robert felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of bonds that had held him prisoner for decades, as if chains he'd worn so long he'd forgotten they were finally beginning to break. "She waited for him?" "Until the day she died," Sarah confirmed, her voice filled with the kind of love that transcends death and time. "She never remarried, never even dated anyone seriously. She said David was the love of her life, and she was content to wait for him in whatever came after. She raised my grandmother alone, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, but she never complained. She said David had given her the greatest gift possible, their daughter, and that was enough for a lifetime." Sarah reached into her purse again and pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. "This was hers," she said, opening it to reveal 2 tiny photographs, one of a young man in military uniform, the other of a baby with bright eyes and a toothless smile. "David and their daughter, my grandmother. She wore this every day until she died." Robert stared at the photographs, seeing David's face as he remembered it, young and hopeful and full of dreams for the future. The baby in the other photograph had David's eyes, the same intensity and intelligence that Robert had loved in his friend. This was the child David had died protecting, the future he had sacrificed everything to ensure. "I've sat on this bench every day for the past 15 years, Robert said, his voice filled with wonder as the pieces of the puzzle finally came together. "Not knowing why I felt drawn to this place, not understanding why I couldn't seem to leave this neighborhood. I thought it was just a nice, quiet spot to sit and remember. But now—" Sarah looked around the park with new understanding, her eyes taking in the familiar sights with fresh perspective. "This is 3 blocks from where I grew up, where my mother grew up before me, where my great-grandmother Rose lived until she died 5 years ago. You've been watching over us all this time, haven't you? Keeping your promise without even knowing it." "Rose," Robert repeated, the name falling from his lips like a prayer, like a benediction that had been 45 years in the making. David talked about Rose constantly, said she made the best apple pie in Chicago, said she was going to teach his daughter how to bake when she got old enough, said she had a laugh that could cure any sadness, and hands that could heal any hurt, said she was the strongest person he'd ever known, stronger than any soldier he'd served with. She was. Sarah laughed through her tears, the sound bright and clear in the afternoon air, like music after a long silence. "She taught my mother how to bake, and my mother taught me. We still use her recipe every Thanksgiving. She always said it was David's favorite, that she was saving it for when he came home from the war. Even after she knew he wasn't coming back, she kept making it every year, setting a place for him at the table." Robert felt tears streaming down his face, but for the first time in decades they weren't tears of guilt and regret. They were tears of recognition, of connection, of a promise finally fulfilled in ways he had never imagined possible. "She sounds exactly like the woman David described. He said she was going to change the world, one act of kindness at a time." "She did change the world," Sarah said firmly. "She raised a daughter who became a teacher, who taught hundreds of children over the years. My mother raised me to believe in service and sacrifice, to understand that sometimes the greatest love is letting go. And now I'm raising David Jr. with those same values, those same stories." Robert held out the Purple Heart with hands that were steady for the first time in decades, the trembling finally stilled by the weight of understanding, by the knowledge that his friend's sacrifice had not been in vain. "This belongs to your family. David earned it the day he died, saving 2 wounded soldiers while under heavy fire. He died a hero, Sarah. He died thinking about the daughter he'd never meet, and the grandchildren he'd never hold, but he died knowing that his sacrifice meant something. Sarah took the medal with reverent hands, turning it over in her palm and studying the inscription with careful attention, reading the words that had been etched in bronze but had lived in Robert's heart for 45 years. Then, to Robert's surprise, she placed it back in his palm and closed his fingers around it with gentle firmness, her touch warm and somehow healing. "Keep it," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction, with the kind of certainty that comes from a lifetime of understanding sacrifice. "You've been carrying it for 45 years. You've earned the right to hold on to it, but now you don't have to carry it alone. Now you can carry it with love instead of guilt, with pride instead of shame." The baby reached out again with tiny fingers, this time managing to grasp the ribbon of the medal with surprising strength. Robert looked down at the child, seeing David's future in those innocent eyes, seeing the family his friend had died protecting. The resemblance was unmistakable now. This child was David Thompson's great-grandson, carrying his blood and his legacy into a future the young soldier had never lived to see. "David would have been so proud," Robert said, his voice filled with wonder instead of pain for the first time in decades, with joy instead of sorrow. He would have been so proud of the family he left behind. The strength, the love, the way you've all carried on his memory and his values. He would have been amazed to see how his sacrifice rippled through the generations. "He is proud," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had been raised on stories of love that transcends death. "And he's grateful. Grateful that his best friend kept his promise, even when he didn't know he was keeping it. Grateful that someone loved him enough to carry the weight of his memory for 45 years. As the sun began to set over Riverside Park, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Robert of the sunsets he and David had watched together in Vietnam, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he'd carried for nearly half a century. The medal was still there in his hands, but it no longer felt like a burden or a reminder of failure. It felt like a bridge between the past and the future, between the friend he'd lost and the family he'd found, between the young soldier who had made an impossible choice and the old man who had finally found peace. "Would you like to come to dinner sometime?" Sarah asked as she prepared to leave, adjusting the baby in her arms and gathering her purse, her movements careful and deliberate as if she understood the sacred nature of this moment. "I'd love for you to meet my mother. She has so many questions about her father, stories she's always wanted to hear, and I think you might have some of the answers she's been looking for her whole life." Robert nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that had lodged in his throat like a stone, like a prayer that had finally been answered after decades of silence. As Sarah walked away with little David in her arms, her footsteps echoing softly on the concrete path, Robert remained on the bench. But for the first time in 45 years, he wasn't alone with his ghosts and his guilt. He was home. The medal caught the last rays of sunlight, no longer a symbol of failure and regret, but a testament to love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us across time and loss. Robert Mitchell had finally completed his mission, and David Thompson could rest in peace, knowing his family was safe, loved, and remembered by the man who had loved him like a brother. In the distance, Sarah's laughter mixed with her baby's delighted squeals as they made their way home, and Robert smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since 1978. He could feel David's presence not as a haunting ghost demanding answers, but as a grateful friend finally at peace, his promise kept and his family protected by the man who had chosen duty over personal desire and had spent a lifetime learning that sometimes the greatest love is the love that endures beyond death. Sometimes the promises we make to the dead keep us alive until we find our purpose among the living. And sometimes the family we're meant to protect finds us when we need them most, offering forgiveness we never thought we deserved and love we never thought we'd find again. The Purple Heart gleamed in the fading light, a symbol of sacrifice transformed into a symbol of redemption, carried not in guilt, but in honor, not in isolation, but in connection to the living legacy of a friend who had died too young, but whose love had endured across generations, whose sacrifice had created ripples of goodness that would continue long after Robert himself was gone. Robert Mitchell was finally free, and David Thompson was finally home.